Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Business Club in a formal capacity. Delighted to see you here after what has been another challenging few months, and grateful that you've turned out, particularly in this bad weather. A special warm welcome to our guest speaker, Sir Peter Wanless, and also to a number of his colleagues and some of the volunteers from the NSPCC. You're very welcome, and hope that this will be perhaps the start of a relationship with the club moving forward. Delighted, as always, to welcome representatives from Odgers and Cardiff Metropolitan University, and sincere thanks to them, as always, for their continued support. This is a first for the Business Club because, as well as having our face-to-face gathering here this evening, we also have people who are on Zoom this evening, joining in remotely from wherever in the world they may be. I suspect most of them are Cardiff based, but you never know. We may have one or two from Australia. So this is a first. I think it's a venture that we've been thinking about for a while, obviously forced into it in many ways over the last few years with the pandemic, but hopefully it will be a success, but obviously not detracting from the face-to-face events that we have. So to tonight's speaker, delighted to welcome and extremely grateful to Sir Peter, Chief Exec of the NSPCC, for joining us this evening. We, as you know, had over the years guest speakers from a diverse sectoral base, and so we're delighted to have Peter representing the charity sector this evening. Peter was educated in Wiltshire and studied international history and politics at the University of Leeds, graduating in 1986. After joining the civil service, where he held a variety of posts at the Treasury, including head of private finance policy and principal private secretary to 3 cabinet ministers, including Michael Portfillo. Peter held senior positions with the Department of Education and Skills and its successor, the Department for Children, Schools and Families. In 2008, Peter was appointed the CEO of the Big Lottery Fund, and in June 2013, he took up the role of Chief Exec of the NSPCC. In the New Year's Honours 2021, he was knighted for services to children, young people, and the charitable sector. Outside of work, Peter is a lifelong supporter of Somerset County Cricket Club, and he's very impressed that we've managed to lay on this venue this evening for his attendance. I've noticed he's been taking a few photographs as well, so maybe some inside information for your colleagues in Somerset. For those of you who don't know, the NSPCC is the UK's leading children's charity, which has been looking out for the interests of children for over 130 years. And as well as providing support to children in various ways, the NSPCC also campaigns and demands law changes to ensure the protection of children. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Sir Peter here this evening, and we look forward to hearing not only about your career, Peter, but also about the challenges and aspirations of the NSPCC, and maybe a little bit about Somerset cricket as well. Sir Peter Wanless.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that generous introduction. It's like attending your funeral, hearing all those things that I've done. Right. So I'll say a little bit about the NSPCC. A bit about me and how I came to run this extraordinary charity, and a few lessons I've kind of picked up on the way, and then maybe finish with some of the challenges facing children as we're here this evening. So as you've heard, the NSPCC has been around since 1884, and it has always had the same charitable purpose, which is the prevention of cruelty to children. In all that time, it's only ever had 12 chief executives. So if I was feeling the pressure for being responsible for this iconic brand, before I realized there'd only ever been 12 of us running the organization, that is pressure. And the first founder, chief executive of the NSPCC, the Reverend Benjamin Waugh, within the first 5 years of him setting up the charity in 1884, by 1889, the government had introduced the first Children's Act, and for the first time, children were the responsibility not only of the adults they were closest to, but the nation. We all took a collective responsibility for children. So that was an extraordinary achievement within 5 years. So that motivates me to kind of knuckle down and drive forward and do the best we can for children over a reasonable period of time. I think one of the extraordinary things about the NSPCC is how it's reinvented itself down the ages to be relevant to that charitable purpose of preventing cruelty to children. I expect many of you will be familiar with the Full Stop campaign, which was an extraordinary effort to draw attention to the nature and the prevalence of child abuse and neglect. And I think many of us in this room now have a much stronger understanding and appreciation of the horrors and the difficulties and the challenges which children face in their lives. But we're not here to raise awareness about terrible things that happen to children. We're here to prevent things happening to children that get in the way of them having the childhoods that they deserve. Many of you will know that the NSPCC runs Childline, which is here 24/7 for any child with nowhere else to turn, which is an extraordinary service and an extraordinary privilege to be responsible for. And I expect a fair few of you will be aware of our Speak Out, Stay Safe service, which in normal times is in over 90% of the primary schools, the length and breadth of the UK, talking to 5 to 9s and 9 to 11-year-old children in English and in Welsh about the fundamentals of what to do if you have a worry or concern about something that is happening to you and how to speak to a trusted adult, or if a trusted adult isn't available, to contact Childline. NSPCC has around 1,800 employees. We have around 7,000 volunteers, and we have probably about 500,000 supporters who are giving donations, £2 a month, £5 a month, £10 a month. And I think that's what makes the charity really special. 90% of our funding comes from voluntary donations. We are a collective expression of the desire that many, many, many people like yourselves have to keep children safe and give them the start in life they deserve. So often we are told the great strengths of the NSPCC are our independence, our broad base of support, our authority and our expertise around issues of child protection. And that is a real strength, but it can also be a challenge, because people have got really used to the NSPCC being here, being a conscience for children, being a sort of asset to the nation. But there is genuine jeopardy to our existence. We need to keep on raising funds year after year after year. £115 million a year is an extraordinary amount of money to have to raise. And yet we are tiny in relation to the scale of the problem of child protection, child abuse and neglect. Social services across the UK spend £11 billion on children, and that's just the ones who are known to the system. So our ability to think incredibly carefully about what we do directly ourselves, what we enable others to do, what we influence well beyond the NSPCC is vitally important if that 115 million is going to work really, really hard. And that means working in partnership and engaging with services, families, communities, way, way beyond the NSPCC, building that really sort of strong sense of collective endeavour to keep children safe. The other thing I'd just say about the NSPCC that I think makes it really special is, and sometimes people ask this in interviews, they say, what's the culture in the NSPCC? Nice, simple question. And I would say we're sort of a third and a third and a third. A third business, highly carefully, well thought through financial, business, commercial nous to get the very best we can from all the money which is entrusted with us. A third, subject expertise, whether that is kind of government, social work, child psychology, psychotherapists, and a third, fundraisers, people from all sorts of walks of life who are taking time and trouble to raise money for the charity. And when those three constituencies come together, that's the kind of magic of the charity, and that's what enables us to be both locally relevant and nationally significant in what we do. So I'm really pleased and proud of the NSPCC. It's an extraordinary privilege to be stewarding this transmission mechanism between people who want the best for children and children in desperate need of help and support. How did I come to be leading this family, this organization? What have I learned on the way? Well, we often say at the NSPCC, it's childhood that shapes who you become. And that's definitely true up to a point. My mum had a really strong sense of moral purpose and right and wrong. And she was an incredible frustration when I was a child, and especially when I was a teenager. There's all sorts of things I kind of wanted to do and I felt I needed to do, but I had that voice of my mum on my shoulder saying, is that right? Is that appropriate? What would other people think? And sadly, she died when I was quite young, my mum, so she never got to see me in this role, but I kind of think that I'm doing her work. And then my father, he was a music teacher at the local comprehensive school and a big cricket fan, although actually my mum was the best cricket player in our family. She played for Southport Ladies. And so when I was growing up, I wanted to be a rock star or a cricketer, and I've palpably failed on both counts. So when people say follow your passions, that's kind of true, but only up to a point. That said, cricket has served me really well. I chose my university by finding a place that had a test cricket ground. So I went to Leeds and I studied history and politics there, as you have heard, and got really interested in politics. So I thought, oh, I didn't want to be a politician because I was too good at sort of seeing the other side of the argument. But I thought I could be a civil servant. I'll apply to the civil service, which I did, and I failed the fast stream entry exams for the civil service. I've got a bit of a chip on my shoulder about this, if I'm honest. Firstly, I went to like the local state school, and then secondly, I was brilliant on those kind of maths tests and brain teasers and that sort of stuff. But when it came to the grammar questions, I was hopeless. I could write a brilliant story, which would get me really excited, but I didn't really know how to construct a sentence. And that's how I failed the fast stream civil service exams. But they offered me as a sort of consolation prize, a kind of entry-level job in the cabinet office. And I thought, God, that sounds really exciting, doesn't it? I'm going to go to the cabinet and take minutes of the meetings and meet all these politicians. And actually, I found myself working in something called the Senior Staff and Europe Division, which was encouraging secondments between industry and government. And it was all right, but it really wasn't high politics. But I got, after about a year, the chance to be interviewed for a job in private office with this government minister who also had a chip on his shoulder, because not only had he not been to Oxford or Cambridge, but he hadn't been to university. In fact, he claimed he didn't even know how many O-levels he'd got, and that was John Major. And John Major loved the Treasury, but didn't really like all these kind of people with lofty intellect around him. And I was about the 15th down the list to be interviewed for this job. And of course, I walked in and we started talking about cricket, and we hit it off straight away. And so I got the job and started in the middle of the summer. And in the very first week, when my boss was on holiday, he sent this red box back. And he said, would you like to come down to the Oval and we'll do the papers together watching the cricket? I thought, this is a trick question. surely not. So I said, no, it's absolutely fine. Minister, no, we can do it over the phone or whatever, which I think was a mistake because he really meant it. But anyway, we got on very well. As you've heard, I worked for a number of government ministers. including Michael Portillo for 3.5 years. My great contribution to Michael Portillo's life is that he knows nothing whatsoever about sport. And the Treasury, as well as being kind of highbrow, is also strong on sporting metaphors. So I could translate for him things like rolling the pitch and playing with a straight bat and this sort of thing. And he could help me out with the Latin. So that all worked very well. And then he wanted to bring the communication of policy closer to policy itself. This was in the mid-1990s, and I thought this was really a good idea. And you often found that really carefully thought through policies would be launched, and then they'd just be disastrous. And the policy people would say the communicators didn't understand the policy properly, and the communicators would say, how do you expect us to communicate that nonsense? And so I got a job as what used to be called head of information, would now be called a kind of head of communications. And I was very young at the time. It was a great opportunity. Suddenly I had to manage all these staff, but it wasn't popular at all in the government, because most of those jobs were done by communication professionals, marketing specialists, and I didn't have the technical skills. I did have the instinct and the relationships and the sort of policy knowledge, but that was a challenging time. And fast forward a little bit, I remember being the head of information and being called to number 10. By this time, John Major, my first minister, is the Prime Minister. And he's chairing a dinner for regional press editors from around the UK and heads of information, me and these other people who all kind of hate me because I'm a bit of an upstart and haven't been trained the way that they had been trained. And anyway, it turned out this was actually the night before, those of you old enough to remember, John Major resigned the leadership of the Conservative Party, and he said, put up or shut up. If you want to challenge me, challenge me. And I think that night before he was practicing his lines for the sort of leader he was and what he'd achieved as Prime Minister. He worked himself up into this great sort of crescendo, and then he said, but the one thing that defines my leadership of the United Kingdom has happened in the Department of Employment. Now, who's here from the Department of Employment? That was my department. I thought, what on earth is he talking about? I didn't know. So all my colleagues from the other departments loving this. Come on then, Peter, you're going to, oh, who's from the department? Oh, Peter, go on, Peter, tell us, what is it that that has transformed the culture and the nature of the United Kingdom in the Department of Employment? And I'm umming and ahhing, and I said, well, I'm just quite new to the job, and I've been in it a couple of months, and I've set my predecessor, Barry, and Barry's there, and the desk doing his shoelace up. I was not going to get any help from anybody. So I try, what can I say? Well, we've brought down the security screens in the job centres. Yes, that's sort of correct, he said, but that's process. But what we're doing now in the Department of Employment is that unemployed people are treated as human beings. And of course, everyone else, oh, absolutely, Prime Minister, yes. And I'm thinking, oh, that's terrible, I got that wrong. And I remember going home and lying in bed that night and thinking, the Prime Minister asked me a direct question. I didn't know what he was talking about. How can things ever get any worse than this? And the reason I tell this story is that we all have low points in life and you can come back from them. And the next day I went into the office and I replayed it to Michael Portillo and said, what is it in your department that has transformed the nature of government and public service in this country? So I'm bloody clear. What are you talking about? I said, well, we now treat unemployed people as human beings. Of course we do. Yeah, absolutely. He said, right. He said, I'm going to get the chief executive of the employment service in. So he got the bloke who runs all the job centres to come for a meeting, and he asked him exactly the same question. What is it that has transformed the nature of public service in this country? Because you are responsible for it. And again, this chief executive didn't have a clue what he was talking about. So that made me feel a whole lot better. And that's probably the low point of my civil service career, although it kind of is equal lowest point with working for David Blunkett when I was his director of strategy and communications. Because, by the way, there was an election, as you know, in 1997. Alistair Campbell came in, said, we've got to bring policy and communications closer together. All of a sudden, I am the future. And off we go, education, education, education. And I'm the director of strategy and communications in that department. But one Friday evening, it's always Friday, 4:30, phone call from the Sun. Has the Secretary of State got any comment to make about the spelling mistake in the literacy poster that's been sent out to all primary schools? So that was another tricky one, which also taught me, if you know something has gone wrong, which we sort of did, it's better to plan for it and work out a strategy and bring your boss together than to hope no one will notice, withdraw the poster and issue a whole load of new posters. That was a very awkward moment, which David Blunkett and I sort of laugh about when we see one another these days. So there will be setbacks, but there've been, extraordinary events too. At the lottery, it was an incredible privilege to be responsible for distributing hundreds of millions of pounds to charities and community groups of one kind or another across the UK. And that was my first kind of UK-wide organisation, and have really enjoyed both at the lottery and at the NSPCC this sense of dynamism and learning which we can gain from the four nations of the UK, working with and learning and challenging and supporting one another. There've been other really kind of odd moments. It's quite fun having a royal patron. Ours is the Countess of Wessex. I once had to go around to her gaff at Bagshot Park to show her a DVD. And that was quite fun, her kind of scrabbling around on her hands and knees, trying to put this DVD into her DVD player with this great oil painting of her on the wall. And I was kind of a bit of an out-of-body experience. And did I really think back when I was at school, I would be kind of sitting watching DVDs with a countess in a kind of royal home? Probably not. I think through all of this, that advice about follow your instincts, follow your dreams does work. I am very passionate and concerned about what's happening to children and what we can and should be doing together to make their lives safer and more secure. I am really passionate about Somerset cricket. I'm not at all sure about Welsh fire. We may or may not want to talk about that, but the chance to be oneself, moving out of government and moving into the charitable sector, for me, the great difference, the great positive benefit is the ability to be a chief executive and to think about the values of an organization and to work to shape the attitudes, the behaviors, the personality that an organization is going to have, which you just can't do administering a minister or more than one minister's ideas of what they should be doing. So for me, that has been a huge privilege. It's a real challenge when you haven't got quite the same bottom line as you have in the commercial world, to think about what's the impact that we're going to have as a charity, how are we going to measure that, and how are we going to demonstrate that when you give us your hard-earned money, we put that to palpable use. And as I referenced earlier, we're tiny in relation to the overall challenge of child protection. So we need to make very careful choices about where and how the NSPCC concentrates its attention. So we did a huge bit of listening inside and outside the charity, as it turned out in the run-up to the pandemic, but it stood us in really good kind of stead through the lockdowns and the challenges of the last couple of years. And we've identified 3 big impacts where we know we can, and in fact, we must make a palpable and distinct contribution for children. The first of these is that keeping children safe should be everyone's responsibility. So yes, there are issues and challenges which affect children who've already experienced devastating abuse and neglect, and there's statutory obligations and responsibilities and budgets for much of that. But we all can play a part in looking up and looking out for children. And if we understand the simple things which each and every one of us can do, children are a whole lot safer as a consequence. There are all sorts of examples of that, but in the last lockdown, the partnership we had, for example, with Deliveroo, where we trained their riders who were out and about in the communities when children weren't out and about in schools, is one sort of illustration of how we can and should build a nation of safeguarders, and all of us can play a part in that. Second one is that the online world should be as safe as the offline world. And you don't need me to tell you that child protection is not designed into online services. We have an incredible opportunity. 4 or 5 years ago, talking to the government about regulating the internet, they were kind of laughing at us. But now we've absolutely won that battle. We need meaningful regulation of social media companies with a regulator with the independence, the resources and the powers necessary to impose and require a duty of care on people who are delivering services to children online, just as we would expect services, toys and all the rest of it which kids consume. And then thirdly, all children should be able to speak out, be heard and understood. If they have a worry or concern, we need to be there for them, and that's where Childline comes in, that's where the school service comes in. And so we will be working with and through others on those 3 impacts over the coming period. I'll draw this to a close. There's loads more I could say. Pandemic has been really challenging for children and young people. I think as a nation, we quite rapidly saw and understood the vulnerability of older people, and we looked up and we looked out for our elderly neighbours, and we focused on the health, the immediate physical health consequences of the pandemic. But the longer term mental health and well-being challenges for children are extraordinarily difficult. There are children experiencing trauma of all kinds. Some have been locked away with abusers in very unsafe places and are now emerging into the wider world. There are some children who've been incredibly comfortable being in a cosseted and protected environment, but the real world isn't like that beyond there. How do we help each and every one of these children come to terms with the trauma they have experienced and move beyond it? All our expert social workers, practitioners would say that children do not need to be defined by things that have happened to them which are not their fault. If we give them the space to listen, if we get alongside them, if we help them come to terms with the challenges they've had in their life, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't flourish. And we know if we listen to children and young people themselves, they don't want to be the COVID generation. They don't want to be defined by lockdowns. They have incredible ambitions, ideas and excitement about the future. And I think it's our obligation and our responsibility as adults to release that potential and help them be the very best they can. Thank you very much. I'll stop there and very happy to take questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Sir Peter, many thanks indeed for that insight to not only your personal career and your journey. I always find it quite encouraging that you chose your university by a sporting aspiration and interest, which I'm sure can resonate with many of us in this room here this evening. So thank you very much for that. We're now going to have some questions, and for those of you who are on Zoom, please, if you have a question, would you like to use the chat box? My colleague is going to read out some of those questions in between me asking and the audience asking Peter here today. So Peter, if I can start, actually, you mentioned 90% of the funding for the NSPCC comes through fundraising activities, and you've also obviously reinforce the challenges of the last couple of years with the pandemic and the impact that has had. What has that meant financially, and how have you managed to overcome that?
Yeah, thanks. So, well, there are two. Depends how you look at the numbers, as with everything. Actually, the last 12 months, if you look at the NSPCC's accounts, we had a pretty good year. We ended up with about the same amount of money, a little bit more than we actually budgeted for, which is an extraordinary outcome and a real tribute to the innovation, the generosity, the inventiveness of the great British people and our fundraisers and our supporters, plus some exceptional support for people and things that we couldn't do because they were simply impossible during the lockdown period, like the school service. So the furlough scheme helped us underpin some services there. We attracted extra money in for things like the NSPCC helpline, which when children were out of sight and out of reach of schools and other adult professionals, really kind of came into its own as a kind of safety valve and a source of support for the wider community. So we raised extra money short term for extra activity short term. So that's the positive glass half full answer. Glass half empty, on that 115 million, we were down about 10 million pounds last year. So there was a whole host of things which we couldn't do: gala dinners, fundraisers, branch and district, local community events of one kind or another. Our original plans were just shot completely through. So if we look forwards and we're planning for services and predictability looking ahead, we've got a real challenge because we have to build back that 10 million pounds and some, given the scale of the challenges that we're facing. Oh, and by the way, as everyone knows, inflation and prices, all of that is going to have a big impact both on people's ability to give, but also on what we can achieve for any given sum of money as a charity. So I feel solid and supported, but real kind of jeopardy looking ahead 2 to 3 years. So the fundraising is as vital as ever.
Questions in the room? Sorry. Yep, is there a microphone here?
Thanks very much indeed. Peter, Alan Michael, Police and Crime Commissioner for South Wales. But before that, I spent 25 years as an MP and part of that as a minister. And I loved the honesty with which you painted the reality of government. Most of us bumble into it and bubble back out of it. So thank you for that. You said that childhood forms the adult, man or woman. And that's so true. Some years ago, Public Health Wales did an analysis of the impact of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, which came out with some 10 impacts, some of them devastating to people's health, some leading them into crime, prison, being the perpetrators of violence, being the victims of violence. And whereas the first set of messages were about preventing ACEs, a lot of us feel that the real priority is to ameliorate the impact of ACEs and enable children to be able to grow up with and through all of that. How does that fit with your priorities and the priorities of the charity? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's really good to see you. I think the work on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is really exciting and very important. And in Wales, there's some brilliant work being done to place that way of thinking central to public policy. And I think all of that is really excellent. My one hesitation or kind of don't forget is, and you didn't in the way in which you put it, is that we absolutely mustn't allow those adverse childhood experiences to define the potential or the opportunity for those children. It is not inevitable if you find yourself experiencing these adverse experiences that will define you forever, but my goodness, it makes it very much more difficult for you to recover. So in that spirit, I think it's a useful analysis in terms of wider public policy, particularly for governments. We've got to like tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. We've got to be tough on adverse childhood experiences and tough on the causes of adverse childhood experiences. The NSPCC, in its latest iteration of its strategy, we have chosen consciously to be more explicitly in the prevention space, to try and work with and through many more people to ameliorate those conditions insofar as they connect with abuse and neglect, than to pick up the pieces after the abuse and neglect has taken place. We're not getting out of that completely. We have something to say about where and how services can and should be organized, and because of the way we're funded, we can take risks and we can innovate and we can invest in research and evaluation of new ways of doing things in a way that I would never have been able to do when I was a civil servant. Now, that's not because the NSPCC is cleverer or better than statutory social workers or government. It's just a fact that because of the way in which we're funded, we can do things in a different way. And I think it's really important we complement the state wherever we can. So, sorry, it's a rather sort of long answer, but in the after the event, I think we're in the transformation, showing what is possible space, and most of our effort is in the prevention and earlier intervention space.
Thank you. I think we had a question over here. Come back to you in a minute.
Good evening. My name's Thomas Williams. I'm a trustee of the Gwendolyn and Margaret Davis charities. The question I had, which was allied to your closing remarks, was with regard to the pandemic. If you were able to travel back in time to March 2020, before the first lockdown, in terms of safeguarding child protection, what would you do differently now?
As the Chief Executive of the NSPCC or as the Prime Minister?
But in terms of the lessons that have been learned in child protection, what are the main lessons that we've learned?
Okay, well, if I ruled the world, if I ruled the country, schools would have been the very last thing that would have closed down. I think the face-to-face or direct connection between adults and children within and beyond the family is vitally important, and I think I would have like to think I would have made different judgments about the relative priority of keeping schools open versus keeping pubs open, or concerts or nightclubs, or all the rest of it. So that's one thing. I don't think the government got it all wrong in any sense of the word. There was a real kind of commitment and concern to look out for vulnerable children and to keep the schools open for vulnerable children, but perhaps insufficient sophistication and understanding of how to create the conditions to enable sufficient of those children to take advantage and be supported of with those services. So far as the NSPCC is concerned, I think we worked well with the government as children became less visible to play this particularly distinctive role through the NSPCC helpline. I mean, it was horrifying to us in the early weeks of that lockdown. The NSPCC helpline for any adult who's worried about a child actually received 24% fewer calls than we had previously, and that's because the service is kind of known by the professionals who seek out advice and support, but they weren't seeing the children. So we had to do something about that quickly. And the government worked well with us to both promote the availability of the helpline and to build the capacity of the helpline to play that particularly distinctive role, which we and only we were able to play. And I think that was a really important and responsible thing for us to do as a charity as well, to step back and think about what is it that now we and only we can particularly do for children, as opposed to saying help, help, we're in danger, please save the organisation. I think the more we can present and understand what we're doing that makes a direct difference to the children, the better.
I have for 26 years run an after-school maths and English centre in Penarth. So literally thousands of children have passed through my hands. I feel absolutely furious that schools were closed. I don't think they should have been closed. But my question is really that during the lockdown, I actually went and visited each and every one of my children, students, every fortnight to see how they were getting on. But the key to me is to child safety is unstable households. You know, where there are partners coming and going and divorced parents and acrimony between the parents. That is the key to everything that goes wrong in a child's life, it seems to me, and certainly is at the root of what is going on with this ghastly trial that's currently in South Wales. Unstable households seem to me the most significant adverse factor in a child's life.
Well, I'd say a couple of things about that. I mean, thank you for all you do for children. That's amazing. And I'm sure you've made an extraordinary difference to, as you say, hundreds of thousands of lives. It's absolutely brilliant. You remind me about not just about the schools, but about health visitors too. NSPCC is involved in a really interesting partnership in Blackpool, where all the services come together, local authority, health, the hospital, business, local community groups. We actually chair the partnership, and it's all about getting as many little children as possible ready for school when they're aged 3 or 4. And our governance requires us to take decisions in the best interests of those children. And right throughout the lockdown, we protected the health visitors because they were doing what you were doing. They were going out and about and going the extra mile to look out for and understand what was happening to the children. I can't speak for Wales, but across England, that was absolutely not typical, and lots of health visiting was stopped as people, for perhaps understandable sort of short-term public health reasons, channeled an incredible amount of resource towards vaccinations and looking out for and supporting elderly, vulnerable people, which of course is important, but those early years are incredibly important in the life chances and the resilience and the development of the relationships that young babies have. So as well as keeping the schools open, keeping the health visiting open, keeping eyes on children and families, I think really matters. In terms of the evidence base for the factors that are most important in risks to children, the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, I think give a really kind of strong checklist. The 3 which come up time and time again, and they are regularly, they're not necessarily always associated with family stability, are domestic abuse, substance misuse, and mental ill health.
I know we have a question from somebody on Zoom. So.
Okay, Sir Peter, a question from Fiona Peel. Are you already preparing for Ukrainian children and indeed any other refugee children? How do you do it?
Well, the NSPCC is not a sort of direct deliverer of services to refugee children. There are other charities that are in that space, but we would be very alive to the risks and challenges of all vulnerable young people in the country. So we will be in touch with the Home Office for sure, and the other children's charities in this space, and doing what we can to help whilst focusing on our particular expertise. Another dimension of what you're describing in the question though here is the anxiety and the worries that children in the UK already have about what's going on here, which isn't to trivialize the desperate, devastating things which are happening to Ukrainian children, but we have children who are already feeling anxious and concerned and are now wanting to know, is there going to be a third world war, etc., etc., etc. And Childline and services like ours can play a part there, and there are some fantastic resources available on the Childline website for parents to help them have those really kind of difficult conversations with children who are feeling anxious, because there's a real skill to this. You mustn't promise what you can't promise. At the same time, there are reassuring things you can say to help young people come to terms with the probabilities and some of the realities here. Sorry, I slightly dodged the question because I think you really need, there are other charities that are more directly, I'd say, engaged with refugees and asylum seekers.
Question here.
Barry Morgan, retired clergyman. The Welsh Government next month is going to introduce a bill where it's going to be an offence to smack any child. Is there any hope of the Westminster government doing that? And do you see yourself as a charity being able to lobby for that?
Yeah.
Because it just seems to me that abuse towards any, why should it be acceptable to abuse a child or smack a child when it certainly would not be acceptable to do that to anybody else?
Thank you for the question, and it's not the first time I've been asked exactly that question since coming to Wales today, which is brilliant. So firstly, not everyone will necessarily agree, but I think you as a nation should be rightly proud of the progress that you are making here and the change that is going to take place in the law. I think it is absolutely the fundamental right of the child. It's not quite kind of it's not creating a new offence to criminalise a whole lot of parents for hitting their kids. It is removing a defence, which is that parents having physically abuse their child can say, well, I was allowed to do that because they're my child. And that strikes me as unacceptable. And all we are saying, all you are saying, is that children deserve the same protection as adults under the law from physical assault. And that feels fundamentally right. I believe you're on the right side of history. Congratulations, well done, Wales. I look forward to it happening in England. I believe it will. We are working very closely and carefully with organisations and individuals who we believe can influence the government to make this change. And I kind of won't say any more than that at the moment, but it has been for a very long time an absolute ambition of the NSPCCs to give children the same protection from physical assault as adults get under the law. And actually one of the most troubling concerns about the nature of the calls and the contacts which we took through the lockdowns was an uptick in the physical abuse of children. And I had thought, slightly optimistically, that we'd been making real progress in terms of the unacceptability of physical violence against children compared with where we were 10 or 20 years ago, but not so sure now. So I think the law can play a part and should.
We'll have one more question, but just leading on from that, I'm ambassador for a charity called Have and Cymru, and a very sobering and quite sad fact is that abuse of women and their children spikes during the Six Nations, which is a very sad thing to hear and something that we've got to obviously stamp out. But anyway, we have time for one last question.
Peter, Peter Davis, a practicing solicitor in Cardiff. Have you ever worked with Sir Nick Clegg? If not, when you manage to get hold of him, what will your message be to him?
Yeah. I haven't worked directly with him very closely, although there's a nice extract in Alistair Campbell's latest volume of his diaries, which has Nick Clegg and me in the same place at a launch of the mental health matters thing, which the lottery was funding, and Nick Clegg played a part in. So I don't claim him as a close friend. I am in regular contact, as you might imagine, with Facebook. Their business model is disgraceful in terms of the priority it places on keeping children safe relative to growing audience share, and the metaverse is the latest kind of really crass example, I think, of a new product which is also very exciting to the consumers, but without giving the first thought to how children can and should be protected in this space. So if and when I get hold of him, and anyone that knows him who can help get us together, that would be my message. How are you going to demonstrate properly that this company will exercise a duty of care to young people on its platforms and have that designed in? Because the technology is fantastic and exciting, and children can and should and want to take advantage of it, and we want them to be able to do that, but it requires a bit of forethought in terms of understanding the consequences for young consumers who are not just kind of little adults. Can I say one more thing just before I stop, which is that we are 90% funded by voluntary donations of one kind or another. We are developing a club, the Childline Cymru Club, which is for companies and individuals who want to join and develop an association with Childline. 90,000 calls and contacts about mental health and well-being from children and young people were taken by Childline in the last 12 months, and around 15,000 of those were handled out of Cardiff and out of Prestatyn. So Wales is playing a really important part in that service, and if any of you are interested in associating with that endeavour and supporting that really special service, which even as we speak is engaging with and supporting children who have nowhere else to turn, then how's your man? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sir Peter, on behalf of the Cardiff Business Club, but also the Cardiff and Wales community, thank you very much for your attendance here this evening, but also to the NSPCC for the invaluable and possibly unnoticed work that you do, because many of us aren't aware of the full extent of what you do. So thank you on behalf of everybody here this evening. Thank you. Sir Peter has already mentioned Howell Peterson, who is a member of the club, is actually the Vice President of NSPCC Cymru. He's an honorary member of the council and of their National Income Generation Board. So Howell, I'm delighted that you're going to give the vote of thanks to Sir Peter. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you to Paul and the Business Club for inviting Sir Peter to give the speech. Quite an apt venue, being at Glamorgan, given Peter's passion for cricket. Just one reflection. Over the last 2 and a bit years, the world's been shit. It really has. Everybody's been impacted by the pandemic and COVID. and obviously last couple of days with Russia and Ukraine. One thing that has impressed me immensely about the NSPCC is that it didn't go into hiding. From the professionals and Peter's main executive to all the volunteers, we tried to adapt. We tried to be proactive in how we could help society to the best we possibly could. I'm immensely proud to be associated with the charity. I'm immensely proud of the work that Peter does, just because he stepped up to the plate when society needed it the most. So thank you, Peter, for coming to Cardiff and giving this speech. Thank you to Paul for inviting Peter, and have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the formal part of the event, but I'd like to look ahead to our next events. In March, we have Dan Frumkin, Chief Executive of Metro Bank, who will be our speaker on Thursday, the 31st of March for a dinner event. That's kindly sponsored by the Metro Bank and Blake Morgan solicitors. And then a very quick turnaround in April, within the week. We have Rear Admiral Jude Terry. This is taking place on April the 6th, again, an evening event sponsored by the Reserve Forces and Cadets Association for Wales. Admiral Terry has become the most senior ranked woman in the history of the Royal Navy, and I'm looking forward to welcoming him here to Cardiff, as I'm sure you will be. So please look out for details of those events on the website. Finally, thank you again, Peter, for coming here this evening and giving us an insight into the great work that you do as a charity, but also some of the challenges that you face, not only ongoing, but because of the pandemic and impact on youngsters. Finally, thanks to our sponsors, Odgers and Cardiff Metropolitan University, for their continued support. For those of you who aren't staying for the dinner, thank you for coming along. For those who are on the Zoom event, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event at the end of March. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.